Well, hello, my name's Alan Clements. I've worked with the Tibet Society and Relief Fund for many years through the 90s, and I'm now Vice President. I've retired, but today I want to tell you about my journey to Tibet and life with some of the Tibetans, a brief review of Tibetan history and culture, and a little bit about my meeting with the Dalai Lama. Well, I wonder how many of you have been to Tibet or know of Tibet, because it's a very long way away from England. It's a large expanse of land, landlocked. It's the size of Western Europe, and it's tucked between India, China, and all those countries south of Russia, Afghanistan, and so on. Well, one thing to know about Tibet is that it's a very high plateau at 12,000 feet above India. There's nothing much lower than that, and it rises up through the mountains in the Himalayas, of course, to Everest, the highest mountain in the world, at about 29,000 feet. The wide open plains are full of cattle. They call them yaks. They've got a woolly coat which keeps them warm in the winter and the cold nights. And they're the main sustenance for the Tibetans for food. Well, there are a lot of very vast lakes throughout Tibet. They're all landlocked, of course, often surrounded by 24,000-foot mountains. Here in the foreground of the picture you can see where they gather the stones together with prayer flags as a sign of offering to the gods. Travelling into the centre of Tibet to Lhasa, the capital city, there are a number of high passes that you have to cross. Here's one covered in prayer flags at the top. It's 5,220 meters. Well, because of border tension of Tibet with Russia, in 1903 the British government decided to send in a party of representatives, small army, into Tibet. They were actually the first ones to invade Tibet that century. They went from Sikkim. They were met by 3,000 Tibetan troops, and sadly about 700 of them died in the process. Well, this military incursion into Tibet ended up with Colonel Francis Younghusband in 1904 entering Lhasa, the centre of the country. They set up a trade treaty, Britain and Tibet. And this developed over the years. By 1911 it was very clear to the British government they recognised Tibet as an independent country. Well, British relationships with Tibet continued through the 20th century, and by 1936 there was an established trade mission in Lhasa, the capital city, and this was headed up by Hugh Richardson, a rather distinguished man who I met in the 1999 before he died, and he had all the memories of Tibet, how it was before the Chinese invasion in 1950, and he had witnessed the Dalai Lama as a young boy, 18, being inaugurated as head of state and the head of the Buddhist religion in that country. Well, one of the very interesting things about the Tibetan Buddhists, is that they believe in reincarnation. And so when the 13th Dalai Lama died, they looked for the new one. Where is the reincarnated new Dalai Lama? And what happens is that the high lamas of their religion sat by this heavenly lake, Namsola, beautiful, vast expanse of blue water, looked into the water, meditated, and had visions of where they might find the reincarnated new boy Lama. Well, indeed that's what happened, and they had a vision of a young boy living in a cottage in a place called Taxta village on the eastern side of Tibet, and indeed they travelled there, found this little boy, and met the parents, and he was put through a number of tests. They had things from the Dalai Lama previously, old things, and then some shiny new versions of those things. And yes, the little boy identified not the shiny, sparkly things that you might expect a young boy to choose, but indeed the 13th Dalai Lama's items. He believed that they were his. So he was chosen as the next Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, taken off to the Patala and installed as the boy Dalai Lama. Well, being the potential head of state and the god of compassion, the boy Dalai Lama wasn't just given a little place to live in. Indeed, he had a 1,000-roomed palace. Here you see it in the picture, the Patala Palace in the center of Tibet, in Lhasa, and it's quite an impressive place. I have to say, I visited it in 1994, and it took a very long time to walk around some of those rooms. Well, as a young boy, the Dalai Lama had a very interesting relationship with an Austrian called Heinrich Harrer. He was very instrumental in introducing the Western world to the boy Dalai Lama. What happened was that Heinrich Harrer had escaped from internment in India. He was a mountaineer, and he traveled up into Tibet and found his way remarkably right into the center. And instead of being sent away or thrown in prison, he was welcomed by the boy Dalai Lama, and indeed befriended him, and they had all sorts of interesting stories and adventures. They're learning about the West. They built a cinema with old films from the West. That's how he got to know about the Queen Mother, who he admired and later met in London. Heinrich Harrer spent quite a few years living in Lhasa, teaching the Dalai Lama about the West and its language, and helping him. He wrote a book about this. You may know about it. It also was made a film, 7 Years in Tibet, and it starred Brad Pitt. Quite a film, worth a look. Well, Tibet had had a long history of relationships with China, sometimes close, sometimes not, but certainly by 1950 they were an independent country. But sadly, China decided that it wanted to take it over. And so in that year, 140,000 troops moved into eastern Tibet, called Amdo, the province of Amdo, and they were met by 7,000 troops, Tibetan troops. The Tibetans had old wooden rifles, the Chinese had modern machine guns and all the other weaponry, and of course the Tibetans were just slaughtered. They didn't have a chance. Later, in 1959, they had moved into the center of Tibet and took Lhasa. It was a pretty sad affair. Well, caught up in the invasion in 1950 was Robert Ford, a British guy. He was a radio operator in the trade mission, and the Chinese put him into prison, and he had quite an experience. In later years, he got the CBE for his bravery. I met him, and we got to know each other in later years, and he always supported Tibet and spoke of it. Well, here is Robert Ford on the left-hand side of the slide. I'm on the right there, rather overweight. And you can see that there was a close relationship still even in the 1990s with the Dalai Lama and Robert Ford. In common with Heinrich Harrer and Hugh Richardson, these three were three of the witnesses of the independent Tibet before the Chinese invasion. Well, when the Chinese troops arrived in 1959 in Lhasa, the Dalai Lama left the Patala Palace and escaped to the edge of the city to his summer palace, the Norbalinka. He had his entourage with him, and things got very tense, and eventually his advisors said, well, you really do have to escape the country for your life. This is what he did. He left one night even though troops were all around him. And he got over to the Himalayas and came down into northern India via Tawang. And it's still an area of tension between the China and India on the border crossing there. Within the next year or two, 80,000 other Tibetans followed him, and they settled in India and were given settlements by the Indian government, and they're still there today. You may have heard of the Cultural Revolution in China that went on in the late 60s, early 70s. And in China, but particularly in Tibet, there was a lot of difficulties and a lot of damage. In fact, in Tibet, the Red Guards blew up every government building, every castle, every monastery, and a lot of the cultural things were destroyed. Very sad. Here you see the remains in 1994 of Shigatse Castle. It was a big castle on the hillside. You can see what's left of it, not a lot. Here nearby in Gyantse was a very historic site. It had 15 stupas, that's what they call this building in front of you, and it was a monastery, and all but one of the stupas were blown up and destroyed. Very pity. Well, after he left Tibet, the Dalai Lama settled. He has quite a nice bungalow at 8,000 feet high up in the Himalayas in a place called Dharamsala. In fact, a town has built up around him over the years of Tibetan monks and those who have escaped Tibet. And he's used this as a base to travel the world and meet people and heads of state all over. He has always preached the idea of non-violence, and he encouraged the Tibetans inside Tibet not to protest violently, but to do it peacefully, and for this he was recognized with the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989. America also gave him the Congressional Gold Medal. While the Chinese have now established themselves across Tibet, one of the things that's helped them do that is they've created the most amazing railway going through from the north of central China into Lhasa, and this has enabled them to bring mass tourism and migration into Tibet. In fact, of 7 million Tibetans left after the war, 8 million Han Chinese have now come into the country and now have the majority of the population in Tibet. One positive thing that's come out of all this is that the Dalai Lama and other lamas, Tibetan lamas, who came out of Tibet, have travelled to the West and around the world and brought to us the ideas of Tibetan Buddhism. It's become a very popular thing, particularly for young people throughout the European and American countries, and well, it's quite an interesting philosophy. The idea of Buddhism, it's all about developing wisdom and compassion for others. The idea is to get into a state of realization and enlightenment, and this is what the Buddha taught us. The Buddha talked about the fact that we are always craving for more. Existence is therefore all about suffering. We suffer because we never have enough. But he taught us a path that led us from suffering. It was called the Noble Eightfold Path. Here's a clip of the Dalai Lama presiding over a Buddhist ceremony in Bodh Gaya in 1998. Tibetan culture is fascinating, and it's full of colourful art. here's a mandala, which is a sand composition that takes many weeks to produce. Sometimes monks create it by scraping grounds of sand into the center of this circle and creating an impression of heaven, their idea of heaven or the universe. When they've finished doing it, the head Lama comes along and scuffs it all away, and this is meant to be a lesson that teaches us about impermanence. Well, we've all seen pictures of Buddhas before, Shakyamuni Buddha, who is the founder of the Buddhist tradition, but I love the picture of the fiery gods, the wrathful deities, the fierce destroyers of obstacles in our life on our path to enlightenment. And I have many pictures like this in my home. Can be a bit scary. They also make really beautiful carpets. Here you see a couple here that I found in a refugee camp in India many years ago. In fact, I bought 150 of them and sent them over to England, and we sold them on a website for charity. These are a couple that I have in my home, and they're a joy to have. At Tibetan settlements all around India, one of the ways that they manage to make money is to have carpet factories and produce these wonderful carpets. Here's some pictures of a carpet factory in the settlement of Tezu in northeast Arunachal Pradesh. Well, the Tibetans like a drop of beer. It's called chang, and it's made out of barley. Here you see a lady drying the barley and then boiling it up into what is like a white milk. It's quite deceptive because although it looks like milk, it's about 20% proof, and it's a great pleasure to have. Here's some examples of Tibetan dancing from some of the camp members at the Tibetan settlement of Tezu in northeast India.
An unfamiliar sight in the Derbyshire village of Bonsall. The monks come from the Tashi Lumpo monastery in South India and are here as part of a 3-month European tour performing dances and Tibetan rituals.
Dances are generally done around the New Year, and they celebrate the whole excitement of the New Year and the throwing away of all the negative things of the previous year and bringing in this new year with the best possible motivation and start.
So we will, like that, you know, if you say that we will take all the negative things and we will throw it, you know.
The monks raise funds from their performances to help their monastery back in India.
The monastery is based in Bangalore in southern India, It's in a big wide open spaces on the plains there. They built a monastery and a school for young Tibetan boys, mostly from families in Ladakh and orphans, to get a Tibetan education and a religious and cultural background.
We enjoy very much in here. We came in here several times, we start from 1999, and after that we came to every yearly we will touring in England, not only in England, we are going to also Europe and somewhere else. Yeah, we like it in here. Yeah.
In 2005, we were lucky enough to be able to arrange for the monks from Tashi Lampo Monastery in southern India to come across and give a performance of some of their Tibetan Buddhist rituals and music and dancing to perform in front of some of the crowds of Matlock here in Derbyshire. Well, when I was about 35, in the early 1990s, I suffered quite a serious family bereavement, and the person who died suffered very badly with liver cancer. She was a very beautiful young woman, and I couldn't really understand how something so horrible could happen. Well, what is life all about? What is the meaning of life if someone so nice can die so horribly? Well, I thought, well, who's the one person who can help me to answer the question, what is the meaning of life? Well, of course, it had to be the Dalai Lama. Well, people laughed. He said, well, they'll never get to see him. But after 6 months, that's exactly what I did do. In 1992, we went into his home at 8,000 feet in Dharamsala. And here you can see in the picture, with my wife Elizabeth, we had a meeting with him. I said, Your Holiness, what's the meaning of life, please? Well, he shrugged his shoulders, laughed a little bit, and said, I don't know. Then we sat down, we had a cup of tea, and for 40 minutes he told me exactly what he thought life was all about, and I had the best talking to of my life. I've never looked back. Well, the Dalai Lama's message was very clear and simple. He said, our purpose in life is to be happy, but most importantly, to make others happy, to help others to be happy. He talked about the long term. We always have hope for a better world, particularly if we believe in rebirth. In order to be happy, the best way is to try to achieve peace of mind. It's all in the mind, happiness. And to do this, meditation can really help. This is what introduced me to meditation, and I've followed it ever since, and it led me to create a meditation garden here at Cascades in Bonsall in Derbyshire. Well, my visit to the Dalai Lama got me very interested in things Tibetan and Tibetan Buddhism. I joined the Tibet Society and eventually became its chairman. I thought I'd better learn more about Tibet, so I planned a trip to Tibet in 1994. The map you see here is the plan: to fly to Kathmandu from Delhi and then travel by jeep with a small group of adventurers. We had a little coach, but we also had a very big lorry with chains and all the equipment for tough roads and mountain conditions. You can see that we travelled through a place called Zangmu, Tingri, Shigatse, Gyantse, and then on to central Lhasa. You can also see in the middle of the map there a lake. That was Namsola, which I've already mentioned about the reincarnated Dalai Lama episode. That was the goal, to go and camp by that lake at 15,000 feet. Well, this was the starting point, Kathmandu. amazing city, full of interesting old architecture, and quite an extraordinary place to start a journey. The first day's travelling into Tibet was a steep climb from 4,000 feet up to 14,000 feet. Far too much to do in a day, really, but you had no choice. And we stopped in Zangmu for a night, and then another day's journey right up into 12,000 feet. This was the campsite where we were. We stayed in a very old building, camping. The view was Everest. It was just extraordinary. But as a bunch of Westerners, we soon attracted the attention of the PLO, the People's Liberation Army, who were quick to come across the fields to where we were to find out what we were doing. This was their base camp and radio station, quite close to Everest, as you can see. Some of our party took an excursion in the lorry up a very steep winding mountain path towards Everest, keen to see the view, and they stayed at Ronbuk Monastery. This was one of the pictures, a pretty decrepit place, full of rats, I'm told. I let them to it, but quite an extraordinary view at 5,000 meters. Some of us explored the village nearby, which was called New Tingri, and it was quite a poor village, but it had a little monastery called Shekhar Kodi, and it was quite fascinating. I managed to stumble in on the prayer hall. There must have been about 50 monks here chanting the puja, the chant of Manushri, the god of wisdom. Lovely picture. Complete chaos. Well, the next major town was Shigatse. It was thriving and doing well, although towering over the town were the ruins of the castle that had been damaged in the Cultural Revolution, which I showed you earlier. I particularly enjoyed the street markets, were full of life and colour. This was a craft stall, all sorts of interesting and fascinating things and objects, too many to explain. You get the idea here. Carvings, jewellery, clothing, and so on. The next day we travelled to the original Tashi Lumpo monastery. It was fascinating. It was one of the few monasteries that had survived the onslaught of the occupation in 1959, and was still continuing to have several hundred monks and worship and so on. Quite fascinating. Here is one of the shrines inside. You can see an awful lot of gold leaf is used, even then, now in 1994, and quite an extraordinary and beautiful vision of different types of manifestations of Buddha. What you often see in the temples are statues of this character, this Lama called Padma Sambhava. He was the original Indian guru who brought Buddhism to Tibet in 800 AD. Characteristic of these very large eyes of insight, and always draped with these white scarves, the katags, the scarves of greeting. The Gyantse stupa was amazing. It was the remaining one of 15, but you had a circular staircase inside it, and you could travel right up to the top onto the balcony, and everywhere you went there were little shrines with gods and offerings and so on. Really fascinating old historic stupa. Well, at last we got to Lhasa, and the first port of call had to be the Jokan monastery and temple. It was the most sacred place in Tibet, and was also one of the few places that survived the occupation. So it hadn't been destroyed. And you can see here in 1994 still the ladies in front, they're doing their prostrations, and the idea is that they flung themselves onto the floor and prayed, and the more of these prostrations they did, the better their merit, and the better the karma that they would have to bring them a better life. They were burning incense in the courtyard at the front of the temple, and it left a waft of this smell of incense throughout the area. Lots of prayer flags and some really amazing artifacts on the top of the roof, all with symbolic meaning. The inside of the main part of the temple looks like this, where the cushions where the monks kneel and pray and chant their pujas, the butter lamps, and the gods up in the front there that they worship. Well, in the Jokan temple and many temples in Tibet, they were worshipping a particular god, a god that is called Chenrezig, the god of compassion. Of course, the Dalai Lama is meant to be the god of compassion, and of course that's his main theme that he preaches around the world even now. And you can see the figure has 1,000 arms, 1,000 hands, and each hand has an eye. So it's looking out onto the world in compassion to help others. It's an extraordinary and symbolic figure. You can see it has a number of heads and so on. Quite extraordinary. Well, here's a close-up of one of the shrines. You can see the Shakyamuni Buddha in the background and all the butter lamps flickering away, giving an extraordinarily spiritual experience. Well, the Jokan temple, which you can see here in the center of the slide, is surrounded by the main square of the city of Lhasa, and this was as it looked in 1994. Hasn't changed much actually, and they even have at the other end a cafe for Western tourists where I was sitting and admiring the view, surrounded by very high mountains, of course. Around the square and down the lanes, lots of market stalls selling tourist items, but also clothing and food. Here was a particularly interesting one. Maybe you can see walnuts and something that they call sampa. Sampa is crushed barley in water. They make a sort of rubbery paste of it, put it into cubes or balls and carried around as a picnic. Is the staple diet of the Tibetans. But what you may not find quite so appealing, alongside one of those stalls was a bucket of goat's heads. Perhaps they were making soup. Well, the main goal of our journey was to visit the Potala Palace. It had also survived the occupation, and an extraordinary building, 1,000 rooms. The Dalai Lama's flat had been on the top floor where he lived and was able to look down on the city. Probably it had 1,000 rooms, and as you walked around the dark corridors of the building you found all sorts of shrines dating back centuries, all the tombs of the old Dalai Lamas, previous Dalai Lamas, and all sorts of statues and Buddhas and artifacts, quite extraordinary and very mystical inside. Now, the whole point of the day, the 10th of August 1994, was that this was the first time in 40 years that the Chinese had allowed the Tibetans to have a festival of lowering their tankers. The tankers here are the huge cloths in the front of the building, which they lowered down slowly. It took about 3 hours, and the one with the red Buddha on it perhaps was 60 foot across and 80 foot down. In front of the building, I was standing on a roof in front of the building, where must have been 10,000 Tibetans all weeping and praying. excited that they were able to have for the first time this religious festival. And here's a close-up of those cloth tankers draped over the side of the wall. The red Buddha is Medicine Buddha, and the white Buddha is Tara, the god Tara, the goddess of longevity. Well, the crowds of Tibetans were celebrating the festival amidst this smoke of incense that drifted everywhere, and it was quite an occasion. What was noticeable is that all the way down the road, every 5 meters, was a member of the Chinese army with a machine gun, and there was some degree of tension amongst the crowds. And this is Lhasa from the top of the Patala, as it was in 1994. I believe there's a lot of modernization has gone on since then. Rather a pleasant city. Well, this is the Patala and the centre of Lhasa as it is today. The Chinese have put a motorway right through the front of it. It's rather lost its magic. Well, on the edge of the city was this beautiful building called the Norbalinka. It was the summer palace of the Dalai Lama, and it was a beautiful spot in a very large area of parkland. In 1994 it was open to the public, and the Chinese and Tibetans were all enjoying it in their bright clothes, Sunday best. During this festival day and in the park were thousands of Tibetans, and these wonderful tents, marquees, Tibetan style, and they were performing different types of songs and dance and even opera. This young Tibetan family were delighted when I offered to take a photograph of them. They were all wearing their best clothes, and it was all looking very smart. Unlike the rest of the park, which was littered with paper and waste because of all the picnics that were going on. And here you can see some of the male Tibetans sitting playing mahjong. A lot of activity, and they put up tents all through the park, and it was like a happy weekend in Hyde Park. Well, our final destination was Namsola Lake, which I've mentioned many times now, a heavenly lake. It was extraordinarily beautiful. The water was pure blue. The mountains so far away were actually about 24,000 feet, and the lake level was 15,000 feet. And you may see down on the water's edge there our lorry and a little bus with my group where we camped, and it was a really beautiful place to spend a few days. Very peaceful, beautiful and relaxing. Every now and again we'd see some fascinating people, Tibetan people, as we camped, and passing us one day was this troop of Kham warriors, all in their traditional costume. Very colourful. One day on my own I climbed the hillside behind the campsite around the lake. Must have climbed about 500 feet, maybe more, and I sat quietly overlooking this lovely blue water. As I sat cross-legged, meditating and relaxing, so peaceful, and then suddenly circling around my head was this enormous eagle, and it just sort of circled around me and looked at me. We looked at each other, and it was a magic moment for me. I was reminded of a poem by the 7th Dalai Lama, which you see here, an image of a kingly eagle gliding high in space. Were one's mind to glide without grasping in the space of truth itself, clear and void, how excellent. It was a high spot of my holiday. Well, on our way back to Lhasa, we stumbled across a festival. It was the Tibetan Horse Racing Festival, still about 15,000 feet up, and it was full of these warrior tribesmen racing their horses and showing off their costumes. The idea was to pick up white scarves, these katags, from the floor at high speed as they rode along on their horses. The gentleman on the left-hand side also had this very formidable rifle, which was rather impressive. Here you can see him racing his horse, clutching his rifle, which he then led off with a loud bang and picked up white scarves from the floor. Quite extraordinary. In the crowd surrounding the festival grounds, all the Tibetans were in different costumes. You can see also they were protecting themselves from the sun by putting these cloths on their heads, and also spinning the prayer wheels, as you can see with the lady in blue. The lady in pink came up to me as I was filming, and rather strangely plucked at my chest, the hairs on my chest, and I thought, well, this is rather weird. She was fascinated by the fact that I had body hair, not quite as weird as it sounds, that apparently Tibetans don't have body hair, and she was intrigued at this Western man, who must have looked like a spaceman to her, that I had body hair. We were best friends after that. Well, our final meal together as a group was in a restaurant by the side of the road. Here's the kitchens and the young couple that were running the restaurant. It was all very intriguing, if primitive. We were asked to go to the kitchens and look at the food that they were preparing for us. The vegetables looked fresh and lovely, and eggs and so on. But to our horror, we discovered that the soup was to be made from yak's penis. Well, what a way to celebrate the end of a fabulous journey. Well, if you'd like to know more about the Tibet Society, you can look up on the website. Info at tibetsociety.com is the email, and it's a not-for-profit organisation promoting Tibet's history, culture and religion, and they're a great source of information. The charity side is the Tibet Relief Fund, and they continue to try to support Tibetans in Nepal and India and Tibet. You may know that there have been several earthquakes in the last 10 years, and that's given them a lot of difficulty, razed villages to the ground. And one of the recent campaigns they had was bricks for Bakang village in Nepal. Lots more information at these two websites. Thank you.